When the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes arrived in England, it's important to remember that they were not a Christian people. Many of the other Germanic tribes who had conquered areas of Rome and established their own kingdoms there had already converted to Christianity. However, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes retained their pagan beliefs, their pre-Christian Germanic traditional religion, for over 100 years when they arrived into the British Isles. The poem of Beowulf, due to a reference to a historical battle in the poem, can be dated to around the year 515 AD, right around the time when the North Germanic tribes in Denmark and southern Sweden and the Frisian Islands were beginning a serious invasion and conquest of England. So, when the poem was originally written, this was in pre-Christian times, and many scholars believe that Christian elements were added later to the poem by the compilers of the manuscript which we have today. But this will have to be a topic for a later discussion. What I would like to focus on now is the cultural values and beliefs of these pre-Germanic peoples. What were their most important traditions and culture that you can see in the poem of Beowulf. The most important aspect, I think, to understand in order to appreciate the world of Beowulf is the relationship between the king and his thanes. The king rules over a tribe. The king's authority comes from not only his valor in war, but also in his wisdom and his judgment. In Beowulf, many times we see King Hrothgar give beautiful speeches about the values of patience, about the difficulties of kingship, about what the bounds of honor, what we owe to each other because of honor-bound duties. This illustrates that King Hrothgar is, in a sense, an ideal king. At Heorot, he dispenses his rings and he dispenses his gifts to his warriors, or his thanes, as they would be called, his main warriors. This was the primary social obligation of the kings and their warriors in Germanic times. The kings were responsible for governance, for planning wars, and for hosting feasts, and rewarding their warriors at these feasts with rings, with gifts, and with gold won during battle and during war. Also, at these feasts, the deeds of great heroes were sung and celebrated. It's important to remember that poetry was not a medium that was meant to be written down. Poets sang the deeds of heroes, of the gods. Poets in this time were considered sacred figures. And there are many interesting digressions in Beowulf and even figures of poets that illustrate this. And Beowulf falls squarely into this tradition of an epic song or heroic song, more appropriately, sung in order to valorize the deeds of a great warrior. So the warrior ethos, the warrior culture, is extremely important for the Germanic peoples. Your duty and obligations to your king is very important, and these relationships, as understood by the Germanic people, would later lead to the feudal situation in Europe, where kings or monarchs had control over the land, and they granted authority over the land to various knights and various lords for military service. So you see this system already set up and established in early Germanic traditions. The idea that the king must be generous, the king must be wise, and the king must be able to protect his people. You see this very clearly in the poem of Beowulf. Another Germanic cultural tradition that becomes very important in Beowulf and in understanding the Germanic people in general is the concept of weregild and the concept of a blood feud. And you see both of these themes explored in the poem of Beowulf. Blood feuds refer to essentially the constant state of warfare that existed between Germanic tribes throughout most of their histories. You see references in the poems, in the poem of Beowulf, to the Heathobards, to the Swedes and their relationships with the Geats. And many times these are blood feuds that go back to slights and injuries that occurred. In the poem, it is very clear that war is a constant state of affair. Peace is something to be celebrated and enjoyed, but war is the natural order of the world. This is why when Beowulf finally becomes king, it is surprising and the narrative cuts off because there's 50 years of peace. And always hanging over the narrative is this idea of fate, and that it is the fate of people to war, it is the fate of people to die, and it is the fate of good things to come to an end. And if good things come to an end, and must come to an end, the warrior ethos, the warrior ethics stipulate that the good warrior, must die nobly and honorably. We see echoes of this in Scandinavian and Norse religion with the ideas of Odin and Valhalla, where warriors who die gloriously in battle spend eternity feasting with the great god, only to be slain gloriously in the final battle of Ragnarok or the apocalypse. So war and conflict are celebrated in Germanic culture, but there's also a sense of doom that is attached to it, and a sense of sadness, and a sense of loss, a sense of the inevitability and the cruelness of fate. And you feel this in Beowulf. And even though there's a Christian element to it, involving the savior of the soul and the ultimate redemption of mankind, hanging over the poem is still a sense of dread and a sense of doom, which was powerfully felt by the Germanic peoples. Another aspect of Germanic culture that's important to understand for the poem is that these were a seafaring people. We see right at the very beginning of the poem, or near the beginning, Beowulf travels over the seas in order to assist King Hrothgar, to whom he owes a debt. Beowulf relates his sea battle with the monster in the ocean, as well as his swimming competition with Brecca, which he ultimately loses. The Norse people and the Germanic people were very much known for their seafaring ways. I'm sure if you've studied anything about the Vikings, their constant raids on France, their constant raids on Ireland, even down the Volga and to Kievan Rus. Rurik, the founder of Kievan Rus, was said to be a Viking of Swedish origin. And Viking seafarers had traveled the oceans and the rivers, even all the way to Persia and North Africa. So the idea of sailing, of traveling to distant lands for adventure and for gold and for glory is very powerful. Beowulf himself embarks on his journey in order to prove himself and to prove his nobility. In the Anglo-Saxon ethics, it is only through a person's deeds that they gain honor and that they gain glory. Beowulf's family has a debt honor which they owe to Hrothgar, and Beowulf, as a young man, is unproven. And he arrives on the shores in order to demonstrate his own valor and achieve his own fame, while at the same time fulfilling the obligation that he owes to his family and to Hrothgar. So these aspects of Germanic culture are very important to keep in mind, and you will see how these come into tension throughout the poem. Earlier, I mentioned this concept of weregild. Weregild refers to a Germanic judicial practice. There were no courts. If someone committed a crime, the crimes were not settled by a judge, an impartial judge. The crimes were reviewed not by any higher body. These led to feuds between families. If someone wronged you, if someone stole your property, if someone killed a sibling, it was your responsibility to gain revenge. This revenge could come through payment, so you could ask the family and the tribe who committed the wrong to pay you money. Weregild means man money. And if they refused to pay this debt in gold, they were supposed to pay this debt in blood. And this is one of the reasons why Germanic society was constantly feuding with itself. The Romans took constant advantage of this, and one of the reasons why the Germans were largely unsuccessful with fighting with the Romans for so many years before Rome became so weak was because how divided the Germans were due to these policies and cultural practices of weregild and blood feuds. And we see these habits in Beowulf as well, and the poem seems to comment on their destructive nature as well. So Beowulf simultaneously provides a thoughtful look back and a celebration of Germanic customs and Germanic traditions pre-Christian by a Christian poet who at the same time realizes that these traditions are antiquated, are old, and ultimately will lead to tragedy. And these themes will be explored more when we get to the text of Beowulf and the events of the poem.